Over 2 million people have died fighting under the flag of the United States. Families have been torn apart, communities have been devastated by loss, and untold suffering has been caused by U.S. wars and military operations. What have these men been fighting for? For freedom? Liberation of the oppressed? To establish democracy? Or to protect the business interests of the wealthy?
After 8 long years, the curtain of separation is about to be drawn, the military scene closed forever. You have been valiant soldiers.
In his farewell address, George Washington warned the country of perils that it might face. He told them to avoid political parties, the accumulation of debt, a strong military, and establish an isolationist foreign policy. Unfortunately, this didn't last for long. In the early 1800s, Europe was embroiled in conflict. Britain and France fought each other fiercely and restricted American trade with their opponents. Wanting to avoid a conflict, Jefferson imposed a trade embargo, and American merchant ships were grounded in their ports. This embargo, and the later Non-Intercourse Act, devastated businesses and the economy, leading to widespread recession. Merchants worried about their businesses, and war hawks in Congress, like Henry Clay, clamored for war with Britain because trade restrictions hurt the economy. Jefferson gave in to calls for war, beginning the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was futile. Both sides fought fiercely, but few gains were made on either side, and there were approximately 20,000 casualties. However, the war had successfully defended the American economy.
I'd say the War of 1812 really set a pattern of catering to business interests. Maintaining the economy is obviously of great interest to the government. When the economy is threatened the way it was by the Cuban Revolution, often people in government will call for war in order to protect businesses. To me, this seems immoral. Our government needs to consider that the effects of war are devastating on the human level. It may not be worth it to protect the economy with violence.
Historians usually consider the U.S. imperialist era as beginning with President McKinley, but in reality, the U.S. was well practiced in intervening in other countries before his presidency.
Well, from 1798 to 1895, we had intervened militarily in other countries 103 times. This was usually to protect American interests and resources, especially in Latin America. And by the time the Spanish-American War had started, there was a close tie between business interests and the government. So it's surely not what the American people need.
In 1895, Cuban revolutionaries began a guerrilla war to throw off Spanish oppressors. In the U.S., many people supported the revolutionary cause, which they viewed as similar to their own revolution to throw off Britain. However, the U.S. did not get involved until businesses called for action, fearing damage to American sugar plantations and worrying about the $30 million of American investments on the island. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor because of a boiler malfunction, the U.S. Navy Investigating Committee blamed the accident on a Spanish mine. The newspapers of William Randolph Hearst and other sensationalists called for war, and President McKinley was under pressure from the businesses, the Army, and our very own Teddy Roosevelt.
That McKinley, he was no good. Back in 1898, I remember when I was 16 years old, he declared war on Spain, and I thought no good could come out of this war. And all those greedy goobers in Congress, all they wanted were the Cuban cigars.
The U.S. troops were disorganized, but they did win the war due to their superior numbers and firepower. The war resulted in thousands of deaths on both the Spanish and American sides. It is considered the beginning of the U.S. imperialist era.
The Spanish-American War gave the U.S. control of more territory than they had ever had before. They took control of the Philippines, Hawaii, several Pacific islands, and Puerto Rico. In Cuba, the United States forced the new government to accept the Platt Amendment, which essentially gave the U.S. oversight over all the Cuban policies. American investors got a free hand in Cuba's rich natural resources, and all the Cuban cigars they could ever want.
Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901 after McKinley's assassination. Roosevelt's foreign policy was strongly imperialist. He favored big stick diplomacy, or using the military to force other countries to do what he wanted.
Yeah. So, Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine basically gave the United States the right to intervene in the Caribbean, and him and President Taft basically used that power to ensure that American business interests would be protected. So, under a policy known as dollar diplomacy, they basically were able to send military forces to countries like Haiti and Nicaragua to ensure that they would get their loans back from the governments. And actually, I think that that's one of the reasons for continued instability in those countries even today.
The election of President Woodrow Wilson seemed to signal a shift in U.S. foreign policy. However, despite his ideals, Wilson was not averse to using the military to accomplish his foreign policy goals, as exhibited in the Mexican Revolution and World War I.
President Wilson declared when he came into office that the U.S. would not attempt to capture any more territory. However, he shifted U.S. foreign policy from imperialism to interventionism. When World War I was raging in Europe, Wilson encouraged neutrality, but apparently this did not apply to banks. Bankers like John Jack Pierpont Morgan Jr. lent more than $50 million to the Allies, and this preferential spending forced the U.S. to join the war. If the Allies lost and were forced to default on their debts, the U.S. economy might face a serious recession.
At the time, some people believed that there was an outright conspiracy among munitions manufacturers to get the U.S. into World War I. A Senate committee was set up to investigate this, and their findings were interesting. The Nye Committee was led by Senator Gerald P. Nye. Its purpose was to investigate whether munitions manufacturers like the DuPont Company had conspired to force the country into World War I. The committee didn't find any evidence of outright conspiracy, but the investigation did reveal the amount of influence that big businesses had. If you ask me, it was aliens. The U.S. entrance into World War II was similar to World War I, with preferential loans given to the Allies that eventually forced the U.S. to enter the war in order to protect their investments.
So with Wilson getting us into World War I, that was basically just to protect the interests of J.P. Morgan. And in a lot of the same ways, Roosevelt getting us into World War II was more or less just to protect his interests and assets over in Europe under the Lend-Lease policy. And so really it's a big deal, though, because he doesn't realize that the people can die going to war.
After World War II, the war machine and the government became linked in what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. It became extremely profitable to go to war, and an almost necessary part of our economy.
In Vietnam, we started to see corporations make huge profits off war. The construction of conglomerate RMK BRJ made billions and billions of dollars off building U.S. bases in Vietnam. This pattern of war profiteering continued into modern wars like Iraq, where essentially Halliburton made money from the slaughter of innocent Iraqis. It's a tragedy, to say the least.
Modern economies run on oil, and in recent years, operations like Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom were partially influenced by the need to secure oil reserves for the U.S.
What?
Come on! I recently read an article in the Washington Post in which Alan Greenspan revealed that the war in Iraq was fueled by oil and our need for oil. And this creates a lot more wars in the Middle East fueled by oil. For example, there's a lot of proxy wars going on, and we really don't know what's going. And because of that, alright, I'm gonna scoot to school every day. We scooter pool. And this is just one more thing that you can do to help save the Earth.
The great philosopher and World War II veteran John Paul Sartre once said that when the rich wage war, it's the poor who die. U.S. foreign policy has proven this to be true throughout years of war. The War of 1812, the Civil War, the Sino-Japanese War, the Italian-Swiss War, the Mexican-American War down south. Teddy Rose, he was down there. It's all about economy. Now, in today's wars, the Middle East, that's exactly how the business is run, and this cannot be done. This blatant disregard for human life and human rights is just disgusting.